The Promised Neverland is the new big diggity dog in the farm. This show has caught everyone's attention and is one of the biggest, most popular shows this season. It is a fantastic show, and so far as of me writing the script, 3 episodes have come out and I found them to be pretty good. However, that does not seem to be the case for some people. So now I, being someone who has been reading the manga from the day it started publishing and enjoys it, has a certain bias towards the series. Now as I watched the first episode, I got a good old jog through the memory lane. Therefore, for me, it was the case of someone who has been with this series for some time, getting to see the story I already know animated, with characters having a voice of their own, not the ones I've had in my head, which is mostly Kamiya Hiroshi, Tomokazu Tsukita, Takehiro Koyasu for male characters, and Kana Hanazawa, Minase Iori or Nao Toyama for female characters. So I came in with the expectations of good animation, a soundtrack that complements the tone of the show, an expressive and compelling voice acting performance from the VAs, good pacing, and a faithful adaptation. I'm pretty sure that no one will disagree with me saying that they nailed everything I mentioned just now. However, I'm pretty sure that you guys have already noticed that I didn't have the story as a part of my expectations. So as I already knew everything that happens in the show, for me, it was not about the plot or the setting, but it was rather how accurate the show was to the source and how visually pleasing it was. And for that I can say they did a good job of making the episode very accurate to the source material with just some changes to the sequence of certain pages. They did a very good job of adapting the art style of the manga, which are the more from the recent chapters, while making the edges a little smoother on the character design. So far as of what I've talked about the animation, they did a pretty good job, so why would anyone say that this first episode was anything short of great? Well, that seems to be the case for the people who are anime only. Not all of them, but some of them. So the problem lies in the so-called twist ending and the quote-unquote subtle foreshadowing of something bad about to happen. I did not catch any problems in the first episode on my first watch, but after hearing the views and opinions of some of the anime-only audience on the first episode, I did a second watch of the episode, but this time I went with the mindset of a person who does not know anything about the series. So that is where I started seeing some problems with the first episode. Some people might call it nitpicking, which it is in some ways, and I pointing out these problems does not mean that the show is bad or anything. I mostly talk about how the anime adapted the manga and while stating quote-unquote problems they could have avoided. These are some of the problems most adaptations suffer in some form or another. Nevertheless, I'm going to talk about The Promised Neverland right now, so let's focus on that as I welcome you to the adaptation talk. So the first episode starts with Emma, Ray and Norman near the exit gate of the Gracefield farm from when they were little kids. This scene is there to give subtle hint to that there is something dark lingering behind the light-hearted scenes. So this part actually comes up later in the manga after when Emma reaches the fence while playing tag with Norman, and that is page 16, and the flashbacks are page 17 and 18. So now because of the decision of putting the flashbacks during the opening of the episode, they also had to rearrange the sequence of the events and change some of the scenes from how they originally played out. This actually affected how the foreshadowing and the something bad is going to happen vibes were introduced before the final act of the episode. Now let's divide the events of the anime and manga into parts for easier understanding. So in the manga there is the intro, Act A and then Act B, the conclusion. And in the anime it is the intro, Act A, Act B, Act C, then Act D, the conclusion. Now let's talk about the manga first. The intro part is showing us how cute and innocent these kids are and giving us an understanding of their present situation from Emma's perspective. That leads into Act A, which then starts hinting at something ominous with these 3 panels focusing on the numbers on the kid's neck, and then showing us them taking a very harsh looking test for children of their age. To be completely honest, the test scene is pretty accurate to how it feels taking an actual test. Then with a little breather of showing off them playing tag, that leads to Emma reaching the fence inside the forest, which they are not allowed to go near. Then we have the flashback of Emma, Ray, Norman as little kids near the gate, discussing what purpose they think the gates serve and how they are not allowed to leave for the outside world, which hints that there is something wrong with the outside world. And then it is added that the children who left the orphanage haven't stayed in contact with the children at the farm and nobody knows how they have been doing. Then it continues with the game of tag that ends with Norman catching everyone, with Emma being the last one and Ray not playing. Then there is an exposition dump about each of the main three characters' abilities and traits, with each other kids talking about how the three of them are exceptional. And then Act A concludes with Dawn challenging Norman to another game of tag. Act B starts with Emma talking about how it is Connie's last day at the orphanage, with them showing Mama taking Connie's picture off the board, and then Emma talking about how before the age of 12, all the children are arranged to leave the house and are sent to live with foster parents, which was a rule. Then the rest of the Act B plays out as you have seen, with the big reveal and again quote-unquote change of tone, and the manga ends with a panel focusing on the calendar. So this is how the manga is structured. In this structure, the eerie feeling of unease is there lightly throughout the chapter, with Emma's monologue and some of the rules the children have to follow at the home, and the big foreshadowing takes place all together in just Act A. Now let's talk about how the anime adapts this by moving around the structure and changing how some events play out. The intro. As I mentioned earlier that unlike the manga, the anime starts off with Emma, Norman, Ray as little kids near the gate. As it was put during the start of the anime, it presents the scene in the chronological order and not as a flashback. And it also introduces the eerie vibes from the get-go, unlike the manga where they give subtle vibes, and the big first creepy moments begins in the Act A. There is no change of dialogue and no other scene was added in this part. Now we end the intro part with an electro-rock, electro-J-rock opening by Overworld, which then leads into Act A. Act A starts where the intro part of the manga starts, with an added scene of Emma sleeping with the numbers on her neck being center of the focus. This is also another example of anime going much harder on the foreshadowing than the manga, with another added scene showing us the calendar with the date of Connie's departure, whereas in the manga this scene was a very small panel in which you had to really zoom in to even read what was written there. Then the rest of the act plays out similarly to the manga, which then leads into Act B with again a much more focused shot on the numbers on their necks, which lingers for a much longer time. Act B starts with the scene of kids taking a very complex looking test. All the things happen pretty similarly to the manga, with the difference of how they start playing tag. In the anime, it is Dawn who challenges Norman to a game of tag because he is jealous of Norman getting full marks. Whereas in the manga, after the test, they have a free time where they are free to do whatever activity they want to do. So this time they were actually playing tag and Norman loses to Dawn in Janken, making him it. In anime, they also added a scene of Ray taking out a pocket watch, which turns out to be really significant in the later part of the show. But in the manga, they had Norman count down till 10. Now they make some big changes in this part. In the anime, they split out the game of tag into two different games by rearranging some scenes and adding some anime only stuff like the part of Norman catching Dawn and the others and him chasing Emma and then later catching her. This added scene kind of shows how Norman uses tactics to make up for his difference in athletic ability against his opponent. Act B ends with Ray explaining Emma why she always loses to Norman even though she has better athletic abilities, which is similar to how it is in the manga. With that, the Act B of anime ends. Then the Act C of the anime starts with Dawn challenging Norman to a game of tag again, but in this everyone would be out to catch Norman and he has to avoid all of them. This is the part of the anime in which they made some major changes to some scenes and added some foreshadowing and dialogue. Now, contrary to the Act A of the manga, in which Emma alone reaches the outside fence during the play of the first game of tag, and then they are given the flashback of them near the gate as little kids, which then leads to event of Act B of anime and concludes the Act A of manga with Dawn challenging Norman to another game of tag with the condition of everyone but him being it. which in the anime they use it to have another game of tag in which Emma reaches the fence, now not while running away from Norman, but instead in search of him. Then as she reaches the fence, she finds Norman looking beyond the fence and then she catches him. Now in here the dialogue Norman and Emma have are just monologues in the manga that Emma has as she wonders why some of the rules they have were set, telling us that everyone follows those rules without questioning any of them. Then there is some anime only dialogue from Ray suggesting that he knows more about this house and the outside world than the other characters. Then Dawn and the other characters find them, and then there is an anime only dialogue by Dawn which initiates another conversation. In the manga, this conversation takes place during the first game while they were still running away from Norman, but they were not near the fence and Dawn does not initiate the conversation. And the location of Ray was under the tree reading and Emma was near the fence all by herself. And in the anime, in this conversation, there is another anime only dialogue foreshadowing really hard that Ray knows more than what he is letting on. And with that, the Act C of anime concludes. Then Act B starts with Mama taking off Koni's drawing from the board, and then the rest of the events take place similar to how they are in the manga, minus the conversation Koni has while getting ready to leave the house because they already had that conversation near the fence. So then the Act D concludes with a scene of Emma and Norman having an emotional conversation while melancholic vocals are playing in the background. Then to a scene of showing Ray standing outside the bedroom. Then a shot of home as the scene switches to Mama looking at the stuffed toy Emma and Norman dropped as the vocals are interrupted with a very sharp screech and the ending song starts to play and thus the episode ends. So this is how they structured the first episode of the Promised Neverland. Now that I have explained to you how the episode was structured, let's talk about the adaptation. In the start of the episode, the flashback was added during the start so that they could later change how the game of tag would play out by giving them freedom from the structure from the very beginning. Moving on, now I would have preferred if they hadn't played the opening song in the first episode, but considering how much scenes they stretched out and new scenes they added, they were working with a very small amount of source to adapt in a single episode. This is another reason they had to change the structure to adapt it better in the anime. Now I agree that by changing the structure, the foreshadowing became more and more obvious, and the big reveal at the end wasn't as impactful as it was in the manga when the first time this series was published. But then the people working on this series had to make a decision. The decision of either following the manga structure and slowing down the pace and keeping the foreshadowing in the moderation, or changing the structure and adding some scenes to keep a good pace while trading the foreshadowing. In my opinion, they did a good job by changing the format for the first episode. Now, as I mentioned before that I was going to mention some of the problems I had with the adaptation that could be called nitpicking are that the voices they picked for the monsters sounded like I was watching the Japanese dub of The Office. The voice should have been more sinister yet still having the human feel to it. Like I said, nitpicking. Another thing that they missed out on was using some great imagery for most of the exposition scenes, like when they were discussing the outside world in the manga, they had imagery of some of the real life monuments, which also helped in establishing a sense of mystery to how the world was, which is then later cleared by the future information we get later in the series. They missed out on some of the great world building opportunity there. Another thing was that in the manga, when they were talking about Norman's tactical ability, they had a chessboard with Norman on it to make it visually interesting. And similarly, the scene where Emma was talking about children and them being like cattle on a farm. In manga, there was a panel of Mama in a field with barbed wire fence as she was feeding a bunch of pigs. The imagery hits really hard when in the context of the children's situation. In addition, my last problem was that they forced too hard on the calendar and stayed on it for a long time, and also how much they forced the numbers on the children's neck as the center. Other than that, it was a good adaptation, could have been better, but budget's a thing. In a perfect world, it would have been better, but this is also good in its own right. Now, as we are on the topic of adaptation, Kaguya-sama Love is War is another anime airing this season which had one of the best first episode in this season. However, the format and the genre Kaguya's manga follows is different. They had more space to play around with it and adapt it. Replay Value has a great video on the first episode of the anime, so check that one out. The link's obviously in the description. So thank you guys for watching. Remember to subscribe to PewDiePie, then subscribe to me, leave a like and the other thing you already know that, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Until then, stay classy.